Morning all. Let's have a look at the game played just yesterday, Vishy Anand against Hikaru Nakamura in the Zurich Chess Challenge, round 2. So, e4 from Vishy Anand, and Nakamura plays e5. After knight f3, knight c6, we have bishop b5, the royal of pairs. Now this is very solid knight f6, which is the Berlin defense. Now we see in this position Vishy choosing d3. Often players play just castling in this position, or knight c3. These are other popular choices, but d3 is a viable choice. It looks a little bit on the quiet side, but yeah, you know, it's a very, very popular move. Bishop c5 now is the top used move in this position, so it looks quite aggressive to get this bishop out. It's not behind its own pawn chain. Now players with white usually play in this position c3 or castles. Those are the two main moves, slightly more popular than this third move, which is quite popular. 277 games for taking on c6 now, compared to 590 for c3 or 417 for castling. But it's a fairly popular choice. Bishop takes c6, so some structural damage inflicted on black, but it does give black the bishop pair. D takes c6 means that there's pressure on d4, although you might think you know, taken on the centre, but it also like defends e5 indirectly. You might think there's a general rule to take towards the centre, but I think here, let's actually put on a bit here. I think here white can just take this pawn quite safely. Yep. So d takes c6 kind of indirectly defends the pawn, because now we've got queen d4, and that's winning a piece. So after d takes c6, also of course this bishop is developed and threatens actually this quite menacing pin, which would also emphasize black's d4 control. White now plays, usually white plays just to castle, ignoring that kind of threat of bishop g4, or bishop e3 challenging bishop. That's another popular move, or knight d2. But actually it seems the fourth most popular move. Actually only a little game sample. I mean, it is frequently played just to stop bishop g4 in the first place. And now Nakamura chose, yes, quite a rare-ish move, bishop e6. He's got a very aggressive intent. Nakamura has said often, you know, the opening of a game is making a statement of what the game's gonna be like, your opening choice. And here a very aggressive statement is being made actually, because this can potentially prepare black for castling queenside. In fact, now in this position, knight c3, and we're kind of out of book. We have here a very, very interesting opening after queen d6, where black is preparing to castle queenside. There was a very famous Fischer game where Fischer inflicted double pawns and won very quickly. So it's not always safe to do this, castling queenside, even with the bishop pair. With that structural damage, that can backfire on black quite badly, potentially. White castles on the king side here, and black does castle queenside, so often games are very exciting with kings on opposite sides. We see now the move a3. Okay, so a3 has ideas that maybe b4 and b5 in the future, just to hit that c6, would be quite useful. White wants to potentially wrench open this b file. Black now uses a very aggressive knight maneuver, knight h5. So going into that sensitive f4 square, it's been made a little bit more sensitive than usual because of this h3, because it's difficult then to evict the knight with g3 because of the h3 loose pawn. So this is quite an annoying knight maneuver for white to deal with, in fact. And I think it does make b4, well, b4 could be played here, but there's also knight a4 if white wants to use a bit of piece play for a moment rather than b4. And in fact, knight a4 was played. So here, let's have a quick look at this position. By the way, just one more point though, the knight is not actually, although it's a loose piece, knight takes e5, we can just play queen takes, there's no problem here for black. Okay, so white counter-reacts with knight a4, and if knight f4 immediately, this wasn't played, then b4 is actually, I think this is quite dangerous for black. Bishop b6, and now white has actually various ideas in this position. He could either double pawns or even take on f4. Okay, but Nakamura actually put his bishop on b6. He doesn't mind having two sets of double pawns. Very impressive block of pawns actually visually here, and Vishy does inflict this on black after a takes b6. So is this solid or is it a liability? These four pawns here, this grid of pawns. Well, if they're undermined, I think white has a structural plan available in theory in this position, which would be to try and intensify pressure on e5, as well as try and inflict something like this plan to try and weaken c6, then try and play for e5, and then maybe even this diagonal could be dangerous for c6 and the a file. This is quite a dangerous plan. So b6 is the underminable pawn, immediately underminable pawn. Forget b4, b5 now. So a4 is actually played, and it is quite a dangerous position for both sides, double-edged position. We see Nakamura being very cautious now about playing knight f4 immediately. I think, let's have a look at knight f4 immediately. White can play bishop takes f4 and try and use this structural plan of a5, and this is a little bit on the dangerous side for black immediately. So f6, there are nice choices for white here. Maybe actually even a takes, or a6 might be quite good as well, just for the a file play, but even a takes b, or even going for e5 with queen e2, because e5 is a little bit of a vulnerability in black's position. If this can be used for white, then c6 pressure can be brought to bear with a knight on e5, with a6 being more effective. So there are some issues potentially structurally for black here, but Nakamura, he plays actually f6, and this gives the impression that maybe, as well as depriving the use of the g5 square, maybe also g5 and knight f4 will be very attractive for black. If ever bishop takes f4, then there's g takes, and the g file could be dangerous. As well as that, it's also ruling out, of course, knight g5s. In this position, for example, if knight f4 had been played immediately, knight g5 is also a move which is plausible here, which would actually try and get some of the tension out of the position with a small advantage for white. Potentially the bishop couldn't move back without dropping f7, so white's always got the possibility of taking off the two minor pieces here. I think Nakamura was after maximum tension and complexity as well, so I think f6, as well as ruling out g5, creating the idea that maybe g5 is on the cards, is more about keeping the complexity of the position. Bishop e3, and actually in this position maybe g5 is a little bit on the slow side, because now pointing at b6, a5 is more effective. Let's have a quick look at this. If g5 was played here, a5 is actually quite strong as a threat to deal with. What does actually black do here? If knight f4, I mean, this is just asking for, well, losing a pawn there immediately. So if b5, then we see now in this position, actually there's even a tactical liability to exploit with knight takes g5. That knight is loose now. So forget g5. So knight f4 was played. Now a5 was played, and actually white looks good here. From an engine perspective, white is doing very, very well in this position. But it is a double-edged position. The kings are on opposite sides. It is dangerous for both sides' king safety, potentially. So what to do about b6? Well, Nakamura now plays b5, and here it seems as though white could have considered the move a6 in this position. It does weaken c6 a little bit, and this can be actually tapped into technically. For example, b6, okay, slightly weakening c6. Now white could take on f4, he takes, and play to try and expose c6 with a move like rook e1, trying for e5 and knight takes e5 to try and expose c6, and also later queen f3. So I think that is a viable plan for white. For example, king b8, e5 takes. This could be getting quite unpleasant for black, this sort of position. But it wasn't played actually. Here another plan was chosen, which does try and put more pressure on e5. d4 was played, but it does give black a tactical opportunity to create a complex position where white's king safety is put into question, maybe a little bit quicker potentially than black's king safety. I think overall a6 does look pretty dangerous in this position for black. I mean, another, b takes, rook takes a6. There are numerous threats in this position, like queen a1, d4 still on the cards. This would be very nice for white. So black would really want to play b6, and then it's kind of, we end up with this situation where bishop f4 is a very simple option to try and break through with e5 or even d4 here. It just seems interesting that d4 was chosen here. Now Nakamura's choice was actually in this position to sacrifice a knight. He plays actually knight takes h3. Now, is there sound? I think fundamentally it creates a position which is actually quite difficult to play for white. And I know usually you'd reserve that whole concept of difficulty to play for blitz games, for more quick games where it's very difficult to find accurate moves. But I think the same principle does apply sometimes to even longer time controls. It's very, very difficult to prove that this sacrifice is unsound here, because there's a lot of tension in the position. White takes, of course, although maybe from an engine point of view there is an alternative here to taking this pesky knight in king h1, believe it or not. What would black actually do here? For example, if e takes d4, then white actually might be usefully carrying on with his own plan here, sort of treating that as a pawn sack with a6, and then c6 is put under scrutiny. But the thing is, black apparently here has other ideas in this position. Black can actually play knight g5, and if takes, mind you, a6 is still dangerous. It's still a bit dangerous for black. So this looks actually like a very viable possibility to explore from a scientific angle of this game. If king h1, just to try and give white an extra bit of crucial time for pursuing his attack. This is a very interesting move, king h1. Just treating it as a pawn sack. So ed, we've got queen d4 or knight d4. It's a very interesting position. But anyway, okay, g takes h3 was chosen instead. Now bishop takes h3 carries with it very, very crude threats, actually. Queen e6 to queen g4, just mating white on g2. But these are actually, quite difficult to parry here. What is white doing about this very crude plan? What would be one of the best moves? What was actually played? Should the rook be moved? Okay, let's imagine in the game d takes e5 was chosen, but if we move the rook, it seems quite dangerous for queen e6, but actually there is a defense here, or numerous defenses for holding g4. Knight d2, knight h2, and even knight h4, or even king h2. I think the most promising is actually technically knight d2. If black ever takes on d4, bishop f4, and I think white's starting to do very, very well here. g5, we can just drop the bishop back, and we're looking forward to things like queen f3 even, with pressure on c6 later, with e5 break on the cards. So that is one viable thing to do here. Just move the rook with rook e1. That seems viable. But d takes e5 was played. Another move 17 choice. This is a very technical position to analyse, actually. Very, very interesting to analyse. a6, trying for white's attack. Offering the exchange. If the exchange is taken here, I don't think this is very good at all. Here, bishop takes f1. There's actually a remarkable idea in a7, trying to queen the pawn, forcing king d7. Queen takes f1. I mean, white's got bishop and knight for rook anyway. It's not like ordinarily losing the exchange. It's bishop and knight versus rook. And this is really quite dangerous now. There's all sorts of threats like queen h3, queen g2, trying to bust open the king side. What does black actually do here? If rook a8, for example, d takes. If f takes, just as an example, rook d1 splat. So this is really, really dangerous as well. This a6 move. I'm not entirely sure what would be the best defense. And there's a load of analysis. I'll put it in the description of the video, but just to give you a hint at some of the variations. If b takes a6, d takes e5 looks really scary for white. If queen e6, just trying for this crude mating with queen g4. Knight d2 though. Bishop takes, queen takes, f takes. This should be okay for white, because white has actually got a neat maneuver as well as the a file pressure, and this should be quite promising now for white in this position. Okay, so it does seem as though a6 could cause some problems here for black on move 17. Other options. After b takes a6, I mean, even rook takes a6 as well, instead of that scary looking d takes e5. Here, on queen e6, actually I'm not sure this is that desirable, this particular position. It's really quite difficult. Knight d2 here is now threatening things like d5 and knight b3. If black wants to keep the tension in the position, then I think it's just such an enormously complicated position then even a natural move, it might actually be worse than a move like knight b3, threatening knight c5 and rook a8. Enormously complex position here. What does actually black do? This is really troublesome. If queen g6, queen takes f1, we carry on with the attack. If the bishop like moves off here, let's say the bishop moves off here, just to give you an idea, then knight c5, and we've got this huge threat. We caught the king in a mating net. So it's incredible stuff, but it does seem objectively that a6 might be quite dangerous for black in various variations here, around here. But in fact, okay, the move d takes e5 was played. Queen e6, so crudeness continues threatening queen g4 mating. Now Vishy played knight d2 addressing that. And here, if black cashed out the exchange with bishop takes f1 and carried on after that. If f takes e, let's say king h2, bishop takes. This is okay. Well, it's threatening to calm things down, even with queen h3 here, to get the queens off potentially. So okay, that pawn actually wasn't taken on e5, just bishop takes f1. It wasn't taken with the pawn anyway. Queen takes f1. Now to take with the pawn or with the queen, Nakamura chose to take with the queen. In fact, I think actually this might be technically best here. And let's see why. If f takes e5, there's always king h2. I think this is a point that this queen h3 is quite useful here to gain a critical tempo, protected by the king. So queen takes e5. I mean, lines can still be opened here, and it can be quite dangerous for the king if these rooks can be brought to bear, not just in the centre but against white's king. We see here now the engines actually think this is about equal. So even though it's knight and bishop versus rook scenario, it's just such a complicated position here. c3, king b8, and here black closes the lines totally against his king. After a6 he makes his king very cozy with b6, and he's about to block this pawn as well, and then continue to create some cold wins for the white king here. So he's going to make things cozy for himself first, and then he'll continue his own attack. But he doesn't play king a7 immediately here. a7 I think is harmless for white. If queen g2 wasn't played, a7, I think just king a8, and it's cozy anyway for black there, the king. So we see actually queen g2. And Nakamura plays actually against this rook d6, as though f5 and rook g6 just to skewer the queen to the king, and offering g7. This is just really frightening stuff if g7 is taken. I mean, in terms of difficulty to play the position, I mean, it's going to be very, very high for white and very, very low difficulty for black. For example, queen takes g7. Black could actually play something like this, threatening to skewer again. This just looks like a way a computer would play. King f1, queen d6, with numerous threats like this. Queen f7, h5, and that h pawn, just pushing the h pawn, is really dangerous for white like this. Black's going to end up being significantly better, for example, like this. And then with b4, you know, the queen's also sitting on very dangerous squares here. So black's overall better. The knight and bishop's kind of tied down. So this kind of queen takes g7 just looks impractical to play. So instead, actually, the calmer knight f1 was played. But this might actually be a slight inaccuracy, actually. Cold winds are heading for the white king here after f5. So is there anything better than knight f1? And not involving queen takes g7? it's difficult. It is actually quite a difficult position to play here. I would say extremely difficult, because it looks as though black's play is just easier. There's less pieces to coordinate, and it's easy to make sure that the rooks have some lines of attack. In terms of coordinating the knight and bishop here, it just seems much more complex. If knight b3, let's go with knight b3. What is white actually doing with this? Maybe a plan like f4. It just looks too loose thing. But it can actually be prevented if f4 is danger for c6 later along this diagonal. That could be a danger, leaving the pawn on a6 for b7 to be marked out, try and open up this diagonal. But black could play, for example, rook e8. If knight d4, see, welcoming the exchange of queens might be okay. This kind of scenario, the knight would be quite good here. There's these double pawns, c5 without losing b5 is a problem. But even here, I think black is better here, even without the queen on. But with the queen on, it does seem like a very scary position here for white, especially after knight f1, f5. Cold winds are facing the white king here. It's difficult to coordinate the bishop and knight. And what's worse is this cozy king after king h7 just blocks the a pawn, unless this diagonal is going to be a major liability for b7. So let's see what happened. E takes f5, queen takes f5, now threatening rook, things like rook g6, just to create a nasty pin. Knight g3, queen drops back to d7, protecting c6, and also introducing rook d1 check as quite dangerous. White now plays queen e4, so he doesn't mind rook d1 here. The queen's still eyeing c6 in this position. I think black, though, is better even with rook d1. He actually just played king a7, just securing his king and making sure a7 is not a problem. So keeping all his options open, keeping the tension of the position. Lots of attacking options are available to black here. He could either pin this knight, move the h pawn, or both at some point. So king g2. Now the h pawn does go down, so pushing back potentially this knight to an awkward square. White plays queen f5, and Nakamura is keeping the tension going, keeping the difficulties for white, throwing difficulties at white with queen e8. No respite. Queen e4, keeping an eye on c6 at least. Queen f7. Now it's played again, avoiding exchange of queens as well. Queen f7. So still rook g6 and h4 look like the crude threats to deal with, but how? It's impossible. How to stop this h pawn? King h1. The h pawn is flung forward, so the knight's starting to stumble. Knight e2. And this was actually, this knight e2 was apparently, it's actually a very, very bad position anyway in this here already. Knight f5 isn't that brilliant either, rook e6. And here of queen d3, I think we can just even go with rook f6 just to evict this knight from f5. Queen d5 check. I mean, this is still, it's so much easier to coordinate the rooks than knight and bishop here. But I think this was promising a little bit better than the game. So knight f5 was probably more accurate than the game continuation. In the game, the knight went back now to e2. Now technically the advantage is now just shot up even more for black. So why? Well, rook e8, the queen goes to g4. The queen's really getting kicked around now. Rook g6 and goes to h3. Looks very passive. Queen d5 check, and this prepares something quite nasty now after king h2. It is actually a crushing blow in this position. I mean, there's a faint possibility if black's not careful of getting mated on b7 if his rook wasn't there and there was time to do this. But Nakamura plays a very, very strong move here, which doesn't really give white's time to do anything like that. This rook's only supporting this pawn, it's all blocked, it's cozy for the king here. And Nakamura exposes a bit more white's king vulnerabilities here. Can you see what black plays in this position? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now, you might want to pause the video. So black to play here. Black played rook takes e3. He's weakening that d2 square with that move, and that would be a very, very nasty pin against the knight. There's not much choice here apart from taking it. So queen d2, nasty pin and win, as they say. How to defend this knight? It's pretty dire. In the game, queen f1 was chosen. I don't think queen f3 is any better. Queen f3, black can just play rook f6. In the game, rook f6 was played here anyway. And the problem here now is, although the knight can be protected, it's white's king's had it here. The winds are kind of icy winds and crushing now against white's king safety. White actually resigned here. If, for example, queen e1, then queen takes e3, and numerous threats, the main one being rook f2, just to win back material with interest or mate the white king. So, for example, knight d4, check, and white's getting mated or losing the queen, having to give up the queen. It's hopeless. What else is there apart from knight d4? There's not much. Knight g1, again, rook f2 is absolutely crushing for white's king. So the attack has broken through here, really. Also, in this final position, if we go back, after rook f6, if queen g2, which seems another natural way to try and protect the knight, then here actually, the queen can actually be deflected from protecting e2 with h3. So the knight's dropping off here. This is horrible. Where can the queen go to support the knight? If queen g4, rook f2 check, for example, and then it's all pretty hopeless. Rook takes e2, or even just rook g2, just winning the queen. So there's not much hope because of this h3 resource in this position. Even queen takes e3 is possible just for rook f2, and if rook f1 again, this h3 resource is crushing here. What can white do without losing the rook now? Queen g4, rook takes f1. So yeah, the final position, black has well and truly crashed through after this queen d2, and it's rook f6. This h pawn still lingers to overload white in some of the variations. Okay. So yeah, this rook takes e3 just exposes white's king safety, as well as that vulnerable knight in this position after rook f6. So yeah, it was a game which shows great complexity. I think if there was a technical opportunity for white to try and expose the black king, I believe it might exist in move 17, at move 17, with the idea of a quick a6 here in this position. This is quite interesting variations here, which I'll put in the description of the video. Very, very tricky game. But even maybe without the d4 plan as well, though, this knight could have actually been snapped off to avoid all this knight takes h3 business. Instead of d4, there's a possibility of just bishop takes f4 here, just going for a quick e5 with say rook e1, aiming for e5. This is another very interesting possibility, because I think white wants to try and damage this structure and emphasize c6. And by playing for e5 like this, we get open this diagonal, we get pressure on e5 from the knight and queen potentially, as well as a6. I think this is a safe way, I think, of playing it, because I think the whole opening, when we go to the opening, the inflicting of structural damage, I think there's an echo here. That e5 is a bit weaker, c6 is a bit more vulnerable. So this whole idea of trying to break down e5 and undermine c6 is a logical kind of outcome of the opening to carry through to the middle game. But it was I think really it just became incredibly difficult for white to play after that knight sacrifice, to coordinate the knight and bishop against rook with white's king safety issues and black's king quite snug over there. It was just very, very difficult to play for white. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.